Welcome to Religious Rejects, the podcast by Religious Rejects for Religious Rejects. I'm Christine.
And I'm Alycia. Welcome.
Now, this is Women's History Month. So we are going to share about a woman from biblical history, somebody that ran around with Paul, and I'm very, very, very excited about it. What we're going to reject, who knows? Because obviously everybody watching there knows we are for women in ministry.
Yeah.
Okay. But it is Women's History Month, and there is an amazing woman from biblical history who ran around with Paul, who kind of turns everything that we've learned about Paul on its head.
Which Paul should we be listening to? We have the Paul that says in Galatians 3:28, there is no longer male or female, slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. And then we have the Paul in 1 Corinthians who says women should be silent in church and they should go home and ask their husbands if they want to learn anything. So which Paul are we supposed to be paying attention to?
Or the Paul that Thecla knows, who we will be introduced to today, who is a totally different cat from the other two.
I spent many years of my life hating Paul, being mad at Paul. And I have, in the last few years, realized maybe I'm missing something about who the actual Paul was. And so we'll get into that today.
And maybe the actual Paul is even worse.
Well, that's true. Yeah. So we're wondering, who do we want to keep, rethink, or reject?
That's right.
The Paul that we've inherited through some of the religious teachings that we've grown up with, or a Paul that has emerged more with some of the more recent biblical scholarship?
Mm-hmm. For me, obviously I have spoke on this. I was in a denomination that was actually started by a woman and really emphasized women in ministry while our founder was alive. Since she has passed, it does seem as though that has kind of been pulled back a little bit. And here I am in this denomination chasing after this, this goal of being a pastor in this denomination. And I'm having to deal with some interesting thoughts from people. And, the biggest one obviously is just Paul speaks in Timothy about women being quiet and that they need to be submissive to their husband. I remember specifically when my husband and I were pastoring a church, and my husband decided he didn't want to pastor anymore. So he went to work for another company, and I was now going to be the lead pastor. So I call our authorities, for lack of a better word, or the person over me, to tell them of the change. And I remember this man said to me and asked me if I had my husband's permission. Yes, he used the word permission.
Wow.
To be the pastor, because it would be awkward otherwise if I'm over him in the church, but then under him at home.
Oh.
Now, for those of you that don't know, and I have not spoken on exactly which denomination I'm from, but again, our denominational founder literally left her husband in the middle of the night.
Oh.
Because God had called her.
Oh.
So the interesting thing, I was like, our history says this, but today, now I'm under Paul somehow. And it was very frustrating. And yes, I think, you and I have talked a lot. I'm not a huge Paul fan. He kind of rubs me the wrong way and makes me wonder, why are his letters and why are his words so important to the story? What is he actually in the Bible for? Are we supposed to see his letters as the actual word of God? Or is it just a guy who is walking out his own journey and we just happen to be witnesses too through his letters?
And there was something you said in a previous podcast about Paul that I think it might be helpful. What is it you say about
That he didn't die for me on a cross?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
But I
Just
really,
like my husband, Paul didn't die for me on a cross, so I'm not sure why I'm listening. Let's just.
I can see why there might have been a few issues with you
A little bit.
in this denomination. I love it. So I grew up Lutheran, and we had a couple questions from folks from a previous podcast about which denomination I was a part of. And I came from the ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and then its precursors, because the ELCA was formed in 1987. It was a merger of 3 other Lutheran denominations. So, but that's where I came from. And they had started ordaining women, I believe, in the 70s. So we had a female pastor when I think I was in 3rd or 4th grade when our church called a female pastor. As an adult, I since found out that that pastor was gay, which made me super happy to find out. I have since reconnected with her. She actually remembered me.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, so I went to a Lutheran college, and it considered itself a pan-Lutheran college. So people of all Lutheran denominations were welcome there. But the chapel was Missouri Synod Lutheran. Now, Missouri Synod Lutheran, I know the language is all very strange. The Missouri Synod Lutheran Church does not ordain women.
Okay.
And so the chapel only had male pastors at the time I was going to school at this place. I was a pre-seminary student, and I was mixed in with all the classes with the Missouri Synod Lutheran pre-seminary students who did not believe that women could be pastors. And so I remember my senior year of college, there was a debate on campus about whether women could be pastors or not.
Wow.
And I was selected to be pro-female pastors. And I did it because I knew that there were all these people who had never seen a female pastor, and I wasn't a pastor yet, but I wanted to represent that point of view.
Yeah.
But I was so tired of having that conversation by the time I was done with college. I'll tell you, it was just, like I said on a previous podcast, I'll never get those hours of my life back. That was my experience in college, and that was when I heard all of the traditional, that's when people started quoting to me those passages from Pauline letters that say things like, women should be silent in church. A woman is not permitted to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. Women should be subordinate to their husbands. And then another one that people often refer to is from Genesis, where when God is banishing, we're back to that Genesis creation story, God is banishing humans from the Garden of Eden, and women are going to have greater pain in childbearing, and then your husband is going to rule over you. And so somehow this is seen as a way of ordaining this idea that, women are to be subordinate or submissive to their husbands.
Right.
So anyway, so that's kind of a short version of kind of where I came from. The bigger issue for me later came in being gay and feeling called to be a pastor. So being a woman was less of an issue for me than being gay, but we'll get into that in a future podcast.
I did find it interesting, and again, this goes back to what we think we should reject or not reject and all that, and of this idea that Paul's words somehow are at the same level of Jesus's words. I mean, to the point where I had people tell me that because I was a woman pastor that I was going to hell. So the extremity of somebody believing Paul's words gets so out of hand. And it's like, okay, so explain this to me. I'm teaching and preaching and loving God, but because I'm a woman, I can't do that. And oh, by the way, now I'm going to hell because I'm in sin. So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Were they from your church?
No,
Okay.
this was somebody else. Like I think, I did have people come visit the church, and when they asked to speak to the pastor and I said, "Hi, it's me," they did turn around and leave, and I was like, "Okay, that's fine. I get it. If you already feel that way, then I'm not going to probably change your mind, and that's fine." But this was, I believe it was just like kind of in like comment sections of something.
Yeah.
They can't be seen, but they can say horrible things. Um, good news is I didn't believe it, so I'm fine.
Yeah. Well,
So,
that's good.
yeah.
Wow. That's a lot, though.
Thanks for joining the Religious Rejects podcast. This month, we honor the women who've dared to keep, rethink, and reject.
So today what we're talking about is a codex that archaeologists have discovered called the Acts of Paul and Thecla. It did not make it into the Bible, so most people have never heard of it before. However, since it's been found, it's been translated from the Greek, is available for free online. You can read it anytime. And it's a fascinating look at Paul doing ministry with a female disciple who was called and was basically converted to become a Jesus follower through his teaching. And then she followed him. So it's a fascinating, fascinating book. And so today we're going to talk about that and see if it shifts at all our understanding of who Paul was or is or could have been.
Yes, could have been. It is important to note that in the Acts of Thecla, there is a lot of name dropping that whoever the writer was did, and those names coordinate with 2 Timothy. So what happens in the Acts of Thecla is like things that we've known of, like we knew that there was a fallout between Paul and a couple guys. Well, Thecla tells us what happened, so it's very exciting. It's a little bit of like a Housewives reunion with Andy Cohen.
Oh, right, yeah.
Because now we have the full story.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you get
so
to
it's
find out
very
why there's this big
Yes.
argument and falling out. Yeah.
And that's just the side part. That's just the side story. The actual story to me is Thecla, who is, by all accounts, a beautiful, beautiful woman. She was a noble woman. She was from a very, very affluent and notable family from Iconium. And she is sitting one day in her window, and she hears from the house next door Paul preaching, because Paul has been invited by her next door neighbors to preach. So he is preaching. She can't see him. She's just sitting there in this window. And she starts to hear all of these things, and she starts to just, she almost becomes mesmerized. She sits in this window for apparently 3 days. She doesn't eat. She doesn't drink anything.
Wow.
And they do kind of, they describe her as almost being trance-like. So her mother is very concerned and calls Thecla's fiance, Tamris, to come by and say, "Okay, I don't know what's wrong with her. Something's going on. You better come over." And so they come over, and there's weeping and gnashing of teeth because Thecla just won't move. She won't talk. She won't move. She won't do anything. And so they think, and they don't have like a lot of understanding of, and I'm not going to say she had mental illness, but they don't know what's happened. All of a sudden, she's just checked out. And they're like, "Oh my God, she's gone." Tamris is just broken because he was looking forward to marrying this woman. And now it's like there's nothing there. Eventually, Paul then is arrested because what Paul is doing, the things that he's preaching from this house next door that Thecla is hearing, is that women should remain single and that they should remain chaste. Even if they have gotten married, it is a defilement to their body if they choose to have sex, which in my mind goes very that's very different from the Paul you and I had just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
This Paul, according to, Thecla or the writers of Thecla, is saying that Paul is not advocating marriage. Now, we do see that in some scriptures
Mm-hmm.
where Paul says, listen, if you don't have to get married, don't get married.
Right.
And I remember just trying to figure that out, because I think it's pretty a fair assumption. And I mean, I think even today we see it, that women are encouraged not only to get married, but to have children. I mean, there was a whole thing about childless cat ladies and
Oh, yeah.
which, I mean, dream job. Hello. But anyway, no offense to my children that I love, that they absolutely know that listen, just the way it is. But how much fun would that have been? But I didn't grow up in that. That
Right.
wasn't an option. It was always about, we've been praying for your husband, are you praying for your husband? All of these things. And that's the first thing that people talk about. So on the one hand, I'm this woman that's praying for their husband, but then you see Paul say in certain areas, don't get married. And then you have that in Thecla. You see that he's telling these people, don't get married. If you are married, stop having sex.
Right.
Because you're defiling your temple. I mean, in the book of Thecla, there are Beatitudes, and 3 of them talk about this. And you're like, wow.
You're like, what is this?
Yes, what is happening? So anyway, Paul gets arrested. Paul gets thrown into jail, and Thecla finally moves from the window, sneaks out to go see Paul in prison.
Oh.
She's paying off guards. She's doing all this stuff. And she sits at his feet, or she sits there, and she apparently, it says that she just kisses his
Shackles.
the shackles, thank you. And well, eventually, obviously somebody finds her. Actually, the fiance is like, oh my God, she left the window. She's gone. So now they're looking through the entire village for this crazy woman, they think. And then they find out because, people sell her out. Even though she bought their silence with her bracelets, they sold out anyway. And they tell Tamaris, she actually went to go see Paul. So now he's like, oh, no, she didn't. And so he's not happy. The mother is definitely not happy. They don't want her anywhere near Paul. They want Paul dealt with. In the end, Paul is actually not, I think he's probably one of the many wounds that he has, but then he is released. But Thecla is not released. And her mother decides to press charges, full charges, which at that time is being burned at the stake.
Because she wouldn't get married anymore.
Because she refused to get married because the woman didn't have the choice.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so this is where it gets fun. If it wasn't fun already, this is where it gets really fun.
Okay.
So Thecla is put on a pyre. She's tied to the cross. They've lit all of the fire beneath her. The flames begin to rise. And then out of nowhere, a storm comes. The winds come, rain comes, and there's hail. The hail is so big, everybody has to run. Okay? And she's now saved. And she's like, peace out. Can I go? And so she pretty much just kind of takes off. But now she's been exiled because now I think, so she can't go home. So she runs and she finds Paul, who is literally at that moment praying with the next door neighbors. And they're actually hiding too. So family of the next door neighbor and Paul are praying in a cave because now they've had to hide a little bit too.
Well, because they don't want all the young women in town to not be willing to get married anymore, right?
Right.
That would be
and that's
devastating.
What happened. The whole house had been full of virgins and wives.
Ooh.
And there was like a bunch of men outside angry. So they got to get out.
Yeah.
So they're off praying in a cave for Thecla. While the storm comes, Thecla obviously leaves and she finds them in the cave and they're like, oh my God. So what's really interesting, and this is where I get a little angry with Paul. According to the scripture, Thecla is begging to just be baptized. She wants to be sealed for the Lord. And Paul's like, meh, I don't know if you're ready. Which,
Like, what is your...
I know. What is
That's
she
like
meant
a
to
really high standard, Paul.
do? Yeah, like,
You were about to be burned at the stake, and that's not enough for you?
and God saved you, but I guess
I don't know.
more.
Yeah.
I know. I find that very interesting, but that's kind of what it says. He's like, not yet. So she's like, whatever. So she then, at some point, she cuts her hair and she starts dressing like a man so that she can go with Paul and travel with him. So they go on to the next city, and it's Antioch. Again, she is seen as beautiful. And there's a man there, Alexander, and he immediately falls in love with her. And he tries to pay off Paul to get to her.
Oh, my God.
And Paul's like, I don't know her, but she's not mine anyway.
Right.
And I'm like, again, ass. Like, really? Come on. I love that he's like, oh, I don't know her.
Yeah. He's
you
not
couldn't-
really winning any friends
No,
here,
he's
is
really-
it? Yeah.
No, this Paul is like,
Kind of a jerk. Yeah.
but Alexander decides he is in love and he wants Thecla. She has already told him, no, I am a virgin for life. Please leave me alone. I am a noble woman from another village over, and I have been exiled, but don't touch me, kind of a thing. Like, and I believe all of those things were probably something very prominent for that time, explaining who she was and that she was a noble woman. Anyway, but of course he tries anyway, and he tries to forcefully take her, to which, and I have is this picture, and I can't remember what it's from, but it's like, how like somebody pulled that so she takes his cloak and she rips it, but I always think that she kind of pulls it over his head and then pushes it.
Oh, yeah. I like that. Yeah.
Bottom line is she completely embarrasses him. She rips his cloak, she takes his crown, and he is like left humiliated. So now he's angry, even though he's still in love with her. I mean, oh my goodness. So
good for her.
yes.
She's like the original Xena warrior princess. Yeah, that's great. Okay. But it was a sexual assault, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was really, I mean, while this is a great story, the sad truth to these women, and you get to see that these women start to come out in defense of Thecla and that she had good, they were like good, because now she is dragged to the governor because Alexander has been embarrassed and he wants to press charges. The governor is not wild about this idea.
What law did she break? That's what I want to know. Like,
She embarrassed him, I guess. I don't know.
I guess there's a law against that. Okay.
Apparently, yeah. But he goes to complain and he wants her fed to the wild beasts.
Oh,
Yes.
of course.
So, of course. So now, in the midst of this, another woman emerges to take Thecla to her house to wait until her sentencing. This woman is also very high status and has also recently lost her daughter, and she's very bereft. So you have Thecla, whose mother was not great, and you have this other woman, Tryphena, who is missing her daughter. And the two connect. They kind of adopt each other, and it's a really beautiful thing. Unfortunately, though, she still has to go before the wild beasts. Thecla then gets delivered to the theater. She is thrown into this area, and the lioness is released. This lioness apparently walks up to Thecla, sits down at Thecla's feet, and starts licking them.
I love that.
Yeah. So the governor's like, that didn't work. Throw some more in. Okay? So they're like trying round 2. Okay, so they send in a bear and they send in more lions. This lioness continues to protect Thecla. Okay, which is amazing.
And she kills those other
The
animals.
lioness kills the bear and then is killed while killing the lion. So a fight. So now the lioness is gone. The whole time this is happening, there's a group of women outside kind of yelling and screaming, stop doing this. This is horrible. Why would you do this to a woman?
Right.
All she did was say no. I mean, it's kind of like, now that this lioness is dead, Thecla is like, okay, this is it. They're going to release another round of wild beasts. This is probably my swan song. And she still hasn't been baptized because again, remember, Paul was like, yeah, I don't know if you're ready.
Right.
So she goes running to a pool. The women apparently is described that they are like, no, not the pool, because there are man-eating seals in this pool.
Oh.
So she jumps in, baptizes herself because, why not?
Yeah.
If no one else is going to do it, I'll do it
She's a
myself.
badass.
Yeah, and she's like, if these are my final seconds on earth, I want to be baptized. So she jumps in. A lightning bolt hits this pool, and all the seals are dead.
But she's not.
But she's not.
That's amazing.
I know. I just think it's hilarious. But wait, Alexander is still not done. He's still furious. So he's like, you know what, Governor, I've got these bulls. Let me go get my bulls.
Okay, yeah.
We're going to tie her to the bulls. So they bind her up. They tie her to the bulls. She didn't care now. She's been baptized. She's like, I'm good, whatever. And they tie her to the bulls. And then, and I love that this is actually in, and I'm not going to say word of God, but in this book,
Yeah.
they take pokers, make them really, really hot, the irons, and they poke the bull's genitals.
Oh.
And it literally says genitals. One of the older translations said privy parts. I thought that was really cute. But the point is, she is now tied between two bulls with people putting hot irons on these bulls' privy parts. And yes, they get angry, they go crazy, but interestingly enough, somebody with these very hot irons ends up getting her shackles, the wooden things that were holding her. So those go up in smoke, and now she's free again.
Oh.
And at this point, the governor's like, can we stop with this? I can't watch any more of this. And on top of that, this is where it gets a little interesting. So this woman that was like the mother figure, she is so upset that, and she really believes that Thecla is this, needs to be saved. I mean, look at how many times God has saved her. Can we stop this? That she is so exhausted that she faints. It gets back to the governor and Alexander that Queen Tryphena has dropped dead.
Oh.
Now, she really just fainted. But here's the thing. Queen Tryphena, she is a relative of Caesar. So they panic.
Oh.
Because she's related to this family. And so now they're scared. And so the governor looks at Alexander and is like, no more, because we're going to all die right now. And so sure enough, they finally release her. And she is reunited with the queen, who didn't die, just had a fainting spell, or maybe caused a scene. Who knows? Maybe she was smart enough to say, if I just faint and they think that I drop dead, you know what I mean?
Right.
Who knows?
Who knows?
And everything is fine. What is really great about her is that she continues now to follow Paul. Why she follows him, I don't even know. Like, he wasn't there for her, but whatever. Her choice.
Right.
But she continues to follow him until she, for 72 years, she preaches and talks to women and has a ministry, and she dies at 90 years old.
Wow.
In a cave. And people had come to her and all this stuff. And so it's a fascinating story. What's interesting to me, obviously, that we're going to talk about is, who is this other Paul? Why would he be preaching all of those things? And look what happens when somebody does preach, like, yes, women can preach. I mean, look at what she did.
Right.
Yeah. So amazing to me. But yes, that's my story of Thecla.
Streaming from the heart of the Rockies, this is Religious Rejects. Watch, listen, and join the discussion at religiousrejects.com.
In this book of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, we have this story of a woman. She's often described as a proto-feminist figure in the early Christian tradition because she was willing to reject traditional gender roles She chose not to get married, and she, at risk of death, she chose to follow Paul and to live into the early Christian movement as a follower of Jesus and give up being a wife, being a mother, doing all the things that her parents and her fiancé expected of her. And she was threatened with death multiple times because she rejected those traditional gender roles. Her story goes beyond just listening to Paul's teachings. She chose to be baptized, and she chose to live a celibate, independent life, which for a woman was very unusual. And really, they didn't have the freedom to choose those things. They didn't get to make their own choices about who they married or what they did with their lives. So in some Christian traditions, she's called the first female apostle. And there's even a tradition that she became a missionary in her own right, and she was preaching to other women. And so she's an incredible example of how women in the earliest days of the movement, after Jesus died and was resurrected, and how women were pushing the boundaries in their own ways, even when the culture at large was resistant to their leadership.
She really is fascinating. And, we know that there are other female leaders, or at least we suspect that there are other female leaders. Paul talks a lot about Priscilla and Aquila. And by naming Priscilla first, it is often thought that she is actually the head of that whatever ministry that they had. They were all tent makers together. And so it really is, when you stop and kind of think about it, you're like, okay, well, that's interesting. And I understand, but it begs the question, why wasn't Thecla's book included in the canonization? And obviously, we can assume that, that, like I said, that Paul was so ascetic and he was very much against sex of any kind, seemingly, which probably would have put a lot of people off.
Right?
Sure.
Yes.
And
it might not have been the best advertisement for becoming a follower of Jesus.
Exactly.
That might have put people off right from the start.
Yes, absolutely. But it is interesting, and there are some people that will suggest, and I hope that you can speak to this, but like there's the Paul stuff that he wrote in the beginning that we know is Paul, and that there may have been some additions, because again, in the things that we know that he wrote, like in 1 Corinthians and all of these, in some of these letters, he echoes what he seemed to be preaching, which is, if you don't have to get married, don't get married. But if you're just gonna lust around, fine, get married.
Right.
But it's better. He
To
literally
stay.
says it's better to be single.
Mm-hmm.
Now, oddly enough, that never gets picked up.
No.
But But then you have the later stuff that seems to be very different. And maybe you can speak to that, because we know for sure that there are certain books written by Paul. Yes?
Yes. And so that's a whole conversation that we kind of need to explain and unpack right now, because depending on which church you've grown up in or which tradition you're a part of, you may or may not be aware that there are some books in the New Testament that are attributed to Paul that people do not actually believe Paul wrote.
Right.
But that disciples of Paul, who shared a lot of his beliefs and tried to write similar styles of letters, that they weren't actually written by Paul, that they came much later. And so let's kind of talk about that a little bit and what we mean by that. What we know from Acts, the book of Acts in our Bible, is that Paul never knew Jesus when he was alive. Paul had the famous encounter on the Damascus Road, where he is converted from a persecutor of Jesus followers to a follower of Jesus.
Right.
And that's a very famous moment in the book of Acts. So then what happens is Paul becomes effectively one of the first missionaries who is telling people about Jesus and spreading the word far and wide. And the book of Acts talks a lot about what that's about and the stories of what happens. There's interactions between him and the actual disciples of Jesus, and there's some tension at times and some disagreements and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So
I think it's fair to say that Paul was pretty polarizing even then, and not even just to women,
no,
to everybody.
to everybody.
Yeah.
I think he must have been quite a unique character.
Yeah.
Honestly, at times I've kind of felt like, it would have kind of been fun to actually meet the actual Paul and see what he was actually like, as compared to like this Paul that we have all inherited. And there's so many different versions of Paul.
Yes.
So anyway, what happened was Paul would travel around. He was not really allowed to be in the area around Jerusalem. He was kind of sent further away because I think the other disciples got really annoyed with him. They're like, nope, this is our territory. You need to go beyond. So he goes further afield. He went to parts of Turkey and Syria and Greece. Those are the countries we know them as today. He would go and he would visit the Jewish communities in those areas, and he would teach with them for a while, and then he would move on to the next city or town. And then he would write letters to the places he'd already visited because things would come up after he left. People would have questions. They would be confused about something. There'd be disagreements, which, we've never encountered in our church work, right? Yeah. People disagree about what, they should be believing or how they should be behaving. And so he wrote letters back to these places where he had gone and taught before. And that's where we get letters like the letters to the Corinthians, so 1st and 2nd Corinthians. We've got Galatians, which was a letter written to the people in Galatia. We have 1st Thessalonians, which is a letter he wrote to the people in Thessalonica, which was a Greek town. So we have these letters that he wrote, and other Christians who were later found those letters that he wrote to be really helpful and practical in addressing issues that they had within their churches. And so then they made copies of those letters and they would get spread all over the place. But the thing about it is that there are 13 letters in our Bible today that are attributed to Paul. However, biblical scholars in the last, 50, 60, 100 years, as they've analyzed the style of these different letters, they believe that there's really only 7 that were probably actually written by the historical Paul.
Right.
Or, they think he might have had a helper who was a scribe write it, and it talks about that some in our Bible. And so those 7 authentic letters of Paul is what they call them. Those are 1st Thessalonians, Galatians, 1st Corinthians, Philemon, Philippians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. So those are the 7 authentic letters of Paul. The other ones are letters that are attributed to Paul and have a style somewhat like Paul's, but biblical scholars and those who know Greek, they have studied this very carefully. And these are people who have spent way more time learning Greek than I ever wanted to in my life. Greek is not one of my gifts. It's not something that there's a few things I still remember from my Greek classes.
Is it all Greek to you?
Yes!
I couldn't help it. I'm sorry.
And so people who have studied this, they believe there's significant vocabulary differences. There's the way sentences are structured. And so the authentic letters of Paul share similar phrasing, things like that, language. Paul was Jewish, so Greek would have been a second language for him. And so there are certain ways that he would phrase things that were unusual. And so there's things that they point to and they're like, oh yeah, we see this showing up in multiple letters, but they don't show up in some of these other letters. So it's things like that that they notice.
Interesting.
And so that's why what many biblical scholars now believe is that those 7 authentic letters of Paul give us a glimpse of the early Christian movement that was radically egalitarian. And we see this in, for example, the passage from Galatians 3:28, where there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, for we are all one in Christ Jesus our Lord. That's an example of how the earliest Christians, at least part of the movement, was very much about an equal standing, that everyone's status in culture was leveled out so that men weren't above women, Greeks weren't above Jewish people, the free people weren't above those who were enslaved. So that earliest movement was really very different from the culture at large as far as how people interacted with each other. So the economic status of people didn't matter, their gender didn't matter, being free or enslaved didn't matter, what language they spoke didn't matter. All of those things, it didn't matter. Everyone was at the same status level, which was radical at that time and extremely unusual. What people are arguing, these biblical scholars, is that began shifting over time as more and more people became Christian in different parts of the world, in different parts of the Roman Empire, and that was seen as weird. And so what you see is that in these later letters that are not authentic but attributed to Paul, you have more of this language where women need to be submissive to their husbands, which we can see in this story of Thecla. If you have a movement where all the women are not getting married, they're not conforming to expectations, they're not having children, all that kind of stuff, like that would be very disturbing to many communities. And so what these scholars are saying is that the Christian movement became accommodationist. So they started changing that message in order to accommodate to the larger culture and not stick out so much. And so that's where the shift in seeing the letters that are authentic to Paul versus the ones that are later, we see a difference in the status of women.
Yeah.
So if we look at the passages that are used against women in ministry, 1 Timothy, there's one from Titus, there's one from Ephesians. None of those are actually authentic letters from Paul. They're letters that are attributed to Paul from a later movement of the early Christians. However, we do have one passage that is from an authentic letter from Paul, 1 Corinthians. And this is 1 Corinthians 14, 34 to 35. It says, "Women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. If there is something they want to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Or did the word of God originate with you? Or are you the only ones it has reached?" So that's the passage from 1 Corinthians. So what do we do with that? That is considered an authentic letter of Paul.
I've heard that everything that you were saying about the attributed letters, that they may have come later and were possibly written by somebody else to kind of reframe things. But I've also heard that there may have been some things added, which makes me wonder about this verse in Corinthians, because like I said, the other verses in Corinthians relating to marriage and women are different from this, number
Yes.
one. So did somebody add that in order to kind of help with the new ideas that they were trying to create with the later 6 letters? But there's another thought too, and I'm, after having read Thecla and seeing everything that happened to her, is it possible Paul would have been telling women to stay quiet just for their safety. Because, it's interesting to me that you also see in Thecla, like Paul straight up lies, and very similar to what Abraham did with Sarah. Oh, no, this isn't my wife. And it's like, oh, yes, she is, And so here you have Paul like, okay, Alexander asking about Thecla. And Paul's like, I don't know her.
I don't know her.
I don't
She's,
know her.
yeah,
Got
she's
no
a
idea.
stranger.
And it's like, well, we know you know her. We've seen that you know her. She's literally cut her hair and dressing like a man to follow you. And so it's interesting to me that like one place he lies. Now, is he protecting himself? Is he because he's not really protecting her, because that means she's loose. She's like, she's free. But is he protecting himself? And so now we're seeing that like, were they a little bit more savvy, if you will, a little bit more deceitful in ways in order to protect themselves? And is this a possibility in this example that maybe Paul was saying, women, just don't be preaching all the stuff I'm teaching you. Just be quiet. Don't start yelling stuff out in the middle of the things that I taught you, that I'm not going to have sex anymore. Can you imagine? And just,
Right?
And I think that's really interesting, because I'm wondering how much of a stir Thecla created. I mean, you see, at least through Thecla, that, there were a lot of women going to this house, and there's a lot of men outside angry.
Yeah.
So again, was this just another way to protect people?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think we all have to kind of wrestle with that ourselves and decide, what do we actually think? Do we agree with many mainline biblical scholars today that there are 7 authentic letters of Paul, and then the other 6 are attributed and were written by later people? Do we believe that all of those 13 letters are actually written by Paul? We have to grapple with those ourselves and decide, what is it that I actually believe about these books and passages. For me, if the later letters that have most of the anti-women in leadership passages, if those are not actual authentic Pauline letters, then it doesn't matter to me so much what they say, because they don't carry the same weight as the authentic letters of Paul, in my mind. The other thing that I always think about too is, Jesus had nothing to say at all about the status of women and leadership. And if it would have been important to him, he would have said something about, women should not be in leadership. Women should not be disciples. We don't know. There's nothing that survives from the Gospels that we have that have anything from Jesus saying anything about the leadership of women in the early Christian movement. So, in my way of thinking, if Jesus had something to say about it, I take that most seriously.
Absolutely.
If Paul had something to say about it, I take it somewhat seriously, mostly seriously. I'll listen to it sometimes. But once I realized that there was this difference between the earlier letters that are authentic to Paul and the later letters that are trying to accommodate the culture because they were getting in trouble so much, that's when I was like, maybe Paul wasn't so bad after all. I don't know. Maybe I can rehabilitate my understanding of who he was. And maybe I don't hate him quite in the same way that I used to, but
right. And I think there's another side to this. You've mentioned a few times that a lot of these letters were in response to questions that Paul got. So can you imagine reading Dear Abby, but without the opening question? Do you know what I mean? Like, I kind of feel like, is that what we've done? We have no idea what the questions were that were being asked.
Right.
All we have is Paul's responses. There's no context. And yet we're supposed to take everything he says, everything, and somehow, again, apply it to, this is how a church should be run. This is how this should happen. This is how this should happen. And again, we don't have the full picture.
We don't.
So why do we do that?
the other thing that had occurred to me too is that sometimes he would get letters, but other times people would come and find him wherever he was. And so it was kind of a game of telephone. Like,
Yeah.
I come from Corinth and I'm coming to tell Paul something, but I was told something, but then I made up my own story along the way. And so, yeah, who knows what the actual situation was in some of these churches, especially if he wasn't getting a letter, but an actual report from a person. We don't know. Things
Yeah.
get garbled all the time. And you're right. I think that is another important question to consider. I do think that there are many things when we read these authentic letters of Paul, we see what happens when humans are in community together.
Yes.
It gets messy. And I think that's why these letters have survived for so long, because people recognize in them the struggles that they have in their own local congregations.
Right. Right.
And that's because human beings are human beings, and we can make a mess whenever two or three are gathered. Yes, Jesus might be among us, but we also have 12
But
different
so is our-
opinions about which.
So is our baggage.
We have 12 different opinions then about what color to paint the church sanctuary
Mhm.
or what color carpet to put in.
Yeah. I do feel like so many people have taken just the human element out. And there is almost an idolization of Paul and that forgetting that, no. Like, he was polarizing. A lot of those disciples did not like him.
Right.
They didn't trust him. They didn't like him. We see that he has a fight with somebody and that, things break up. We see that there are people trying to get him arrested, people that once followed him. And I'm not saying all of this discounts what he says, but again, for me, that does kind of put a little bit of a pause in my, like, well, why am I going to listen to everything this man said? Why? And why am I building doctrinal ideas based on this guy who, again, is not Jesus, is not God?
Yes.
He's just a guy kind of running around doing the best he can, just like I am. Sometimes I often wonder, like, if you could talk to Paul like today and say, hey, in your letter to the Hujimijis, you said this and this. And that I thought of, why are you reading that?
Right.
Why is that holy scriptures? Like, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
I think he would be like, what is wrong with you people?
Right. And how did my letters become part of your Bible? Because for him, the Bible would have been the Jewish Bible, which was the Torah, the writings, the Psalms, things like that. And, he might be so surprised to see that some of his letters got put into what became the Christian Bible. Who knows what he would actually think about that? He might be horrified. And I have also often wondered, what other letters did he write that didn't survive, that we don't have? And what did he say in those?
Right.
And for example, so we have the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which is something that is perhaps another, example. People think it was written down later than when Paul lived, but it does describe a particular window of time and things that happened in response to his teaching and the kind of effect he had.
Yeah.
So,
thanks for tuning in. Up next, will the rejects keep, rethink, or reject today's topic? Stay with us.
it comes down to, who do we think Paul was and who do we want Paul to be for us today? Do you love Paul? Do you hate Paul? Do we keep, rethink, or reject Paul?
I think for me, Paul is always a rethink, always. Initially, I used to think that maybe Paul was, or his letters were included. And again, I've never really bought in. Well, that's not true. I definitely reject the idea that Paul's letters need to be something that I have to perfectly live out. I mean, I don't think that they are something that is, what God said necessarily. But I do like the thought, though, that here was this guy, Saul, who was persecuting and killing followers of Jesus, who then has this moment where he meets Jesus, the risen Jesus, and then his whole life changes.
Yeah.
Is it possible? And this is one of the things that I like to rethink. Like, do we then think about the fact that maybe Paul is just there as a way to show you, like, you can't do anything worse than what Paul did.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
and Jesus still said, I can use you. I will use you.
Yeah.
So I always think, like, at my worst times, when I think I used to be under the belief of original sin and I would beat myself up, you know, again, there was these moments where I was like, well, I can't be worse than Paul.
Right.
And Paul's still okay. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like, I
Yeah.
know that sounds horrible because technically all sin is the same. But at the same time, it was like, is that why Paul was in there? To say, keep going, keep trying. Don't let that past, you know, trip you up. You know, do what you need to do. So I guess for me, I'm constantly rethinking Paul. And now, again, seeing this Thecla, now I'm totally rethinking him.
Yeah.
Like, man, he may have been, you know, much more like rigid than I ever thought he was.
Right.
You know, Paul is sometimes described as the first mystic. I see nothing mystical about this man running around saying, don't have sex ever.
Right.
I mean, that's crazy to me.
Right.
You know, like, it's kind of not fun. Definitely not mystical. You know
You're
what
like,
I
I reject that.
I totally reject that. So,
I think for me, I reject the Paul that I was taught, which it's the Paul from the later letters, what are not the authentic letters of Paul. I reject that Paul because those are passages that were used as a bully pulpit against me as a woman who felt called to ministry.
yeah.
And people would say, well, you're not allowed to do that because Paul says blah, 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 blah. And, you know, the rebel in me would say, well, I'm not married to a man, so I don't need to be submitting to anybody because I'm not actually married to a man. But they didn't find that very compelling.
That's fair. I mean, yeah.
If we're going to get really literal about these passages, I'm not married to a man. I don't have to submit to a husband.
Yeah, exactly.
So I reject that Paul, which I have come to believe is not the authentic Paul, but a later interpretation and iteration of the early Christian communities. And then as far as Paul, the authentic Paul, the actual Paul, I'm with you. There are parts of Paul that I love, and there are parts that still I just get so angry with, certain passages, even now. And so, yes, I think Paul is someone who, for me as well, I'm always rethinking because his writings are actually rich and there's a lot in them. However, I will also say sometimes he's very confusing. Some of his sentences, they're very, very much, I mean, today we would call them run-on sentences. And so it can be very difficult to even like follow the train of thought through the whole sentence and figure out what he's trying to say by the end of it. And when you think about him writing in a language that wasn't his original, mother tongue, then you can say, he did pretty well. And it probably wasn't as clear as it might have been had he been writing in his original, language that he grew up speaking and everything. So maybe I'll give him a bit of a break on that. But definitely reject the Paul of the inauthentic later Paul, Deutero-Pauline letters is what they call those. And I'm rethinking the actual Paul. And I think it's hard to even know who he was at this distance of time through so many centuries. I think, anything that we try to actually say was actually him, I think it's all an approximation, really, because it's hard to really know who the real Paul was because it's all filtered through so much history at this point.
Absolutely.
We hope today's episode has at least encouraged you to rethink who Paul was and is for us today, and about the role of his writings on the leadership of women in churches today.
And just in your life in general. How much of his words do you want to take as well? So, thank you for joining us today. Make sure you subscribe, leave a review, share the episode with others who may be interested in learning more about Thecla because she's so badass.
We'd also love to hear from you. Let us know on social media your thoughts about this episode or by sending us an email. You can find us at religiousrejects.com.
Bye.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Religious Rejects.